Warning. The following content may contain elements that are not suitable for some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Dude, that warning. Oh, shit. Oh, crap. Dan. There you go. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depends wherever you are. Thanks for showing up for the third edition of Whisper Insights. Now we're so advanced and mature and grown up that we even have a logo. Upper right corner, right. What is it? There, right there. See, that's the logo. So we have a logo on everything. We're legal. Starting this week, we're going to do this every week. So instead of having to wait 2 weeks for the next episode, we can come back next week where we have an absolutely amazing conversation set up with Liz Miller of Constellation Research fame and fortune, who's going to be talking to me about falsehoods and dichotomies. And yes, we use $5 and $10 words there. So, but this is going to be a fantastic episode about how executives deal with platitudes and falsehoods and how they make decisions and how those decisions affect everything, blah, 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 blah. Down the line, and an hour later, you'll be the wiser for what you heard, if not richer for the information and the insights that you collected. Okay, on to today's show. I've been hyping this on LinkedIn, which is the only social media channel that I have left, for the last few weeks because I'm so excited to have with me today this co-host. She's probably one of the smartest people I know, way smarter than me, which is not to say much, but she has an incredible amount of experience and talent and knowledge around topics that I can't even begin to understand. She has a PhD, so we actually provide the respect she deserves and refer to her as doctor. And she's going to do the rest of her intro because even though I have the pictures and make her be here, she didn't want to, but she'd be happy to comply. I don't want to ruin what's left of her reputation. So without further ado and not many more words, Dr. Lauren Vargas, thank you.
Hello. I didn't know we were going to be like color coordinating today. We totally planned this whole outfit exchange. Very laid back, kind of fun. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for saying that because people would think that we spend hours doing this, and that's not what we do. It is color coordinated. That's nice. I'm actually the only person who's making money of this show, by the way, is my dry cleaner. Just so you know. Now I gotta wear a shirt every week, which I don't usually do. So But anyways, hey, thanks very much for being here. So
thanks for inviting me. It's always fun to chat with you.
Oh, thank you. Why don't you tell the 3 or 4 people that may not know who you are and what you do and what's your PhD and why did you do that and all that stuff,
Yeah. I'm an independent researcher and consultant. I spent the first 18 years of my career working in the federal government and private sector, working primarily for or with online engagement, online communities, both from a customer and an employee perspective. And in 2018, I made the leap and decided I was concurrently as a full-time job, also completing my studies and finishing up my PhD. And in 2018, I left the private sector and moved into the cultural sector, started my first of 3 postdocs. And I've spent the last 5 years or so really kind of digging into the unsexy aspects of digital. I just jokingly refer to myself as a digital dragon wrangler. I'm not there to slay dragons. I'm there to make sense of them. What are the treasures that they hold? What is the messiness? What are the riddles that we need to make sense of? What are those areas of digital that need a little bit more critical thought, that need more time and space for exploration? Where could we have applied research, not just kind of going off in the corner and making our own determinations and trying to force something into the arena, but really working with employers, customers, organizations around what are those ecosystems, what are those cultures that are going to foster healthier digital spaces, and what does that actually entail, and whose responsibility is it, and what are those responsibilities? So that's what I've been unpacking, especially with cultural organizations, which I find is both similar and different from the private sector. Obviously, a lot of the same problems. Humans are humans, especially from a organization culture perspective.
Whoa.
What?
There's no next statements like that. Not all humans are the same, are they?
Well, I mean, humans are humans, meaning they're messy and they're complex and they're chaotic. And
I love that word, messy. It's
I
I
l-
mean, seriously, I used that word a couple of times in executive conversations. Some people who are at the top of their game, they embrace messy like you would not believe, because there's no formula, there's nothing that is set in stone that will be the same for everybody, and only people
exactly.
who understand it, right? And
Yeah.
so what do you do in this case? I mean, first of all, I mean, just to make sure that we understand this, to set it straight, when you say research, you're not just speaking of market research, like marketing, like,
No.
hey, how do you like me? How do you like my job? Type of thing, right?
No, applied research. So I'm an action researcher.
Yeah.
So I'm actually, working embedded in organizations, really applying those learnings in the moment, not just writing them up in some type of fancy kept report, but actually feeding those back into the system, into the organization for continuous learning and development.
Okay. And just for those who are wondering about the bookshelf behind, uh, Lauren every year publishes her, like, list of books that she recommends from the
Mhm.
year, which I proceed to buy. And basically her list is my unread list for the most part. So, but they're all there. I started them all and they're all very good. But I love it. Let's go back to the concept of messy, because seriously, this
Yeah.
is this is a part that, like, it's hard for people to understand, because when you say messy, people think like unkept, untidy, like not organized, not structured. I mean, that's what I think about. I'm thinking that's everybody goes through the word messy the same, but there's more to it than that, isn't there? I mean, in the case of research and decision making, messy is actually where you want to be, right?
Yeah, that's where you make sense. That's where you challenge your beliefs. That's where you bring in different perspectives. You know, the one the one constant, right, is when you're talking about evolution or metamorphosis or transformation, all those damn buzzwords, right? You get the image of the caterpillar turning into the butterfly, and we forget, what's happening in the soup, right? That and there's some scaffolding, there are some components that are left and rearranged, but it's recombining those bits and those elements into and reconfiguring into something else. And we often kind of skip that goop phase, that soup phase. And that's the part where things get really interesting. That's the part where we have the opportunity to interrogate, intended and unintended consequences, to
Oh,
really think
unintended.
through,
Yeah. You speak.
to
Sorry,
really think through what
sorry, I
it
keep
is.
interrupting you. Keep finish what I said. I'll shut up.
No, no,
Here.
no, go for it. Go for it. This is a back and forth. Go for it.
Yeah, I
Go
know,
for it.
but unintended consequences is, like, it's my favorite cup of tea, right? Because, like, it's really where innovation, revolution, everything happens. It's an unintended consequences. You never
Yeah.
know what the fuck's gonna happen. You have no idea. I mean, all these people that set out to nobody sets out to be a hero and change the world. Everybody sets up to do like a small piece of something, and then they become a hero for unintended consequences, and then the law of unintended consequences kicks in, which is not a real law, by the way, but it's more of a natural law. But kicks in, and then things happen and transformation happens. So how do you link, and John, we'll get to your comment in a second. And by the way, my brain doesn't work like yours, so if you have any comments or any questions, please put in there. We'll address them as we go along. But I'd like to finish with this before we get to that. So how do you link unintended consequences, transformation, and, like, engagement? You said that you wanted to think, so there you go.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, can you say? Let
Well,
me put it another way. Can
yeah.
you say that engagement happens because of unintended consequences, or intended consequences? Would be a better question.
I think
It's
it's a bit of
engagements. Go ahead.
I think it's a bit of both. I think, well, it's you have to be I think engagement is intentional.
Yeah.
I love unpacking words, and engagement is engagement, and it's really derived from the meaning of to attract and occupy the attention of. In the earliest iterations of engage, it was really linked to, fighting and arrangements of relationships, marriage, contracts, employment. It's including a specific pledge and a commitment, sometimes with those barriers of time. And in I guess modern interpretations of engagement, you hear things like, capturing hearts and minds and things of that nature. I think that engagement to find engagement, to have engagement, there needs to be some sort of intention. the intention for how are you, what is this involvement with something? Is it for convening? Is it for connection? Is it for communication, collaboration, community? But also leaving that space intentionally to explore the things that you can't plan for, the things, the topics, the areas of interest, those spontaneous endeavors and activities that with all of your foresight you're not really quite able to think of. And so it's being intentional about leaving those spaces. I think engagement, especially like from, I guess, a corporate enterprise size, when you're talking either for customers or employees, it's often terms and kind of code for a certain level of quality or action involvement. And that's determined by a position of power and authority.
Oh
And
my God.
oftentimes it's incredibly ambiguous or prescribed without like understanding of those context or conditions for engagement to thrive. And that's because when we unpack engagement, that can mean levels of enthusiasm, dedication, and commitment, both emotional and intellectual, right? It could mean our
Yeah.
focus and attention. It can mean interest, optimism, passion, flow. But oftentimes, right now, we just look at engagement as a buzzword, as a code for we want
Yeah.
X to do Y so that we can have Z. And there's nothing reciprocal.
See, and
And we
that's the
have to
thing.
intentionally create that.
Sorry.
Yeah, go
But
for
that's a killer. That's a killer part. It's like you talked about a design outcome for engagement, and you talk about unplanned engagement. And in my experience, unplanned is what gets the most value to the company over a
Yeah,
design. Because I mean, look, you cannot say and this conversation I have with many executives, you cannot say I want my customers to be loyal to me any more than
no.
you can say I want my kids to do what I tell them to do. You know.
Exactly. Yeah, because the second you say that, they're going to do the opposite.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and your employees and your customers aren't stupid. They can see through that talk. They can see that you're
Uh,
forcing them in that direction.
right.
So how could you create that scaffolding? How can you create this space for intentional, purposeful progress or engagement?
And this is what you do in research on. It's like, how do you actually build? I know this
Yeah.
because I read what you write and I read what you do, and actually, can you, we're going to talk about it in a second, but like, this is actually related. So if you can put John's question on, Brent. I mean, John Hill, who I used to work with at SAP, says the organizations put back on your findings and trainings, right? Because you're telling them, I mean, let me rephrase what you said into the way I would tell them, because you're a much nicer person than I am. You don't know what the fuck you're doing. You're doing it wrong because you want to design this to be something that you want that benefits you, but the
Mhm.
benefits should be on the other person, and you don't understand that. And that's my
Correct.
paraphrasing of what he said. So when you tell that to a company, an organization, to the U.S. government, to nonprofits, I mean, do they push back on that?
All the time. Because
Okay, and so what
engagements
do you do?
work.
So what do you do? Which is a better question than if they push back. How do you convince them? Or can you convince them?
I don't know. And I go back and forth in this all the time. I mean, especially
Okay.
like as an independent researcher and consultant, because you're kind of going from one kind of gig to the next, or you're trying to find, the right, I guess, collaboration or cohort, et cetera. And I used to think that you needed to convince the entire organization, that you needed to convince all of the execs, and that a job wasn't, I felt like I was quitting, or a job wasn't done if I couldn't get the masses to agree, or at least the powers that be. And now I'm of the opinion that that's just a waste of time, and it's
Oh,
it's finding. I know, right? It's finding the right people to engage, and the right people who are in in a frame of mind, in a state of mind, in a state of action, in a state of practice, that are willing to do the messy, complex bits. And sometimes they're not going to stay in that organization. And it's not really for that organization, but that individual will take that knowledge, will take that impact, will take those findings and bring them into an environment that's much more hospitable. And so, yeah.
Hold on, we'll go back to what I had to say after. Don't worry. I'll let you get back to that. I'm sure you'll be fine. But so what you're saying is like, you work for the long range, not for the short range. Your expected win comes at the end of a lifetime, not at the end of the quarter.
Yeah. And that can be frustrating, but it can be liberating. It depends
Yeah,
on
but
the day.
it totally changes the conversation of engagement, because it's going from like your CEO telling you we need to find something to do about engagement this year to like, you need to change the mentality on how engagement is and what it is so you can actually apply it for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I'm not thinking about, I so often, engagement is very reactionary, or at least what I hear from executives, what I hear from organizations, right? It's very reactionary. It's very like, we need to do this and we need to do it now, rather than what are we doing to set the stage? What are we doing to set the space for generations ahead, for different dilemmas and complex problems that we'll need to unpack in the years ahead, in the decades ahead. And I think that's that's the type of impact, that's the type of work and research and trying to figure out the right behaviors and how people tick and how you create those habits, how you create that atmosphere, that environment for that type of work.
So how do
That's
you go
not
about
always wanted.
I know. I mean, look, executives have a 2 to 5 year lifetime in their jobs, to be fair. I mean, some of them stay longer, but you take 80%, 20% out that stay longer or shorter, but 80% of them stay 2 to 5 years in the job. Either they move somewhere else or they move up or different positions.
That's the nature of the game.
So they're selfish by nature, right? I mean, I was an executive. I don't want to be an executive. I want to be number 2. I want to be like my little friend here, Tyrion Lannister, right? And
Yes,
if you can bring up the comment from,
I've got him up there.
A friend of mine gave me this because he said all you do is you drink and know things. So yes, John, I drank the bourbon at SAP, but that's because that's what I do. I drink and I know things. But I mean, the thing is like, I don't want to be the guy that needs to be making the decision. I want to be the guy advising the guy who needs to make the decision.
Yes,
that's what I do best. Yes, I lose tens of millions of dollars in the process, but I have the ear of people that are actually interesting to talk to. And the thing is like, I have a really hard time convincing anybody in a 2 to 5 year position that they need to set something up for the long run. And what you should say is if you're going to succeed at this, you change the mentality for the long run, right? So what's either, I mean, practical advice or theoretical or your thoughts? How do you actually convince somebody who's trying to make the next bonus check that they need to set up something that they won't see a return on? Or can you? I mean, when I say how, you can replace with can. Either one works. I mean, have you been able to find a way to do this? I don't. I'll be honest. I don't. I talk to people all the time, a very high level, and I say you have to do this because it's the right thing to do for the marketplace and the workplace. We go through cycles. We're in the middle of we're entering a paradigm shift. Brought out by the idea that we can actually use data better. That's where AI is coming from. We are at the end of a generational shift where like Gen Z and millennials enter and master the workforce. So how do we actually tell somebody that like your role here is not to make your next paycheck by rising engagement, whatever metric you fucking try to use, by 2 points, but like by setting up a better framework so that we get into better engagement situations in the future? Have you had those conversations?
I do think that there are ways in which you can have that conversation and be able to create, I hate the word pilot. Pilot is not a word I like to use, but where you can create snackable activities, snackable experiences, experiments to think about different ways of engagement. And all feedback is good feedback, right? If you're not getting anybody to engage, that's great. That's feedback, right? Like, let's take it, let's learn from it. Just because something isn't successful doesn't mean that you don't learn from it and you can't apply it to those long-term learnings, those long-term views. And so it's creating snackable projects, snackable experiments, that tap into different aspects of engagement that can show the potential impact, or that can show the potential work, the deep work that an organization needs to do in order to achieve its aspirations. And so it's finding ways to demonstrate, to visualize what that looks like. I think it doesn't need to necessarily be an either or, but a both and type of conversation. But that's, that's difficult. You've got to have an executive, you've got to have buy-in from the top, as well as the grassroots, type of endeavors. It's
Do you
not
have
one or the other.
Do you have an example of the snackable projects or something that you've done that you can share? I know that some of the stuff you've done cannot be shared, but if you have something that you can share, even at a high level, what would be a snackable project or a snackable endeavor?
I was working with a cultural organization about a year back, and they were preparing to move locations. They were going to have to shut their doors for a certain amount of time, and they weren't quite sure what they were going to do while they were dark, and they didn't know how the community, both physical and digitally, were going to react once the doors were open, once they moved to their location. It might be a completely different community. They were, moving geographic location, and there was going to be a significant amount of time in which they were kind of dark. So we created several different experiments to tap in to already existing community efforts, community, engagement, to see how that organization might be a participant in that conversation, or might facilitate or host some type of crowdsourcing or development and listening sessions and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was all of these little small things that kind of added up to, okay, we're using this time intentionally. We're really, being very critical about the differences, the strengths and the weaknesses of both a physical and a digital space, and what that entails, and how our employees are working with those customers, visitors, potential, community members. And it was pretty eye-opening, because they realized that they were putting a one size, before they closed their doors, putting a one size fits all type of filter on their engagement. And then when they were forced into this, snackable type of environment, they realized, oh, wait a second, there is a level of complexity. There is, the different types of activities, and we have to be very intentional. Are we connecting people? Are we convening people? Are we communicating for some type of purpose or intention or activity? Are we bringing people together to collaborate on a certain project, citizen science or something to that effect? Or are we, thinking about those long-term relationships? What are those communities of practice, interest, place, action, circumstance? What does that mean for us, for that organization? And so they were doing very, very small efforts. They were very lo-fi, very, very, very snackable. But I think it gave like a sense or an awareness, kind of a wake-up call of, whoa, engagement is a bit more than we originally thought it was.
Are these conversations a result of people not wanting to change what they've been doing forever because they're comfortable with it? Or are these conversations a result of people not understanding engagement, or maybe a combination of both?
I think
I
it's
will
a
go for number
combination.
one, but you think it's a combination?
I do. I think that there's definitely like this.
I'm not talking about, like you mentioned. Sorry, you mentioned before.
Yeah.
Unpacking the word. I'm not talking about the proper definition of engagement, right? Because
Yeah.
we can spend hours on that and we'll never get anywhere. But is it because people don't understand what they're seeking when they say engagement, regardless of the definition, or is it because they're so used to doing things in a specific way that they don't see what you tell them? Like, hey, if you do this snackable engagements, snackable endeavor projects, whatever you want to call this.
Yeah.
If you eat these little snacks, you'll be better fed for a lifetime, versus continue to eat Cheetos all the time because that's what you're used to.
I think there's a perception, right, that doing things that the way that they've always done means that they haven't changed. And in actuality, our information ecologies, right, are not stagnant. Even if people are, supposedly doing the same thing, they're creating these workarounds. They are, people are having to work around them. The processes and practices, the behaviors are adapting. They may not be visible, but they are there. And I think that it's a combination of this perception that it is stagnant and therefore it's easier just to keep things going, as well as, quite frankly, it just takes a lot of, a lot of work and a lot of effort. And that's not necessarily something, without a quick turnaround, without a quick metric. And therefore, we don't necessarily want to put a lot of
See, you walked right. You walked right into my trap, because my next question was, can you measure this? What do you do for measurement? Because the typical management attitude is you can manage what you don't measure, which I disagree with 1,000%. But that's one of the stupid fucking platitudes that everybody keeps using because it's easy to say, so you don't have to do something, right? Exactly. But I mean, can you measure? Can you? I hate the word management and heard the word design, but can you measure or manage or design this to be useful to both the organization and the consumer?
Definitely, I really do. Like you can, it's
No.
not, engagement is not just, clicking the like button, right? It is about,
Well,
here
actually,
are
hold
those.
on. For a lot of people, that is engagement, right?
Well, yes, yes, it is a level of engagement, but it is not
Okay.
the end all be all, right? So when we're talking
Ah.
about that intention again, it's what are you trying to achieve? What's that intentional involvement with something? What is that interaction? And being really clear with what you want to measure. I think it is definitely measurable. You can measure, how curious people are in the environment. How many questions are they asking? Um, how are they making connections both physically and digitally? There are different ways in which you can start to suss out this information. But once again, you've got to be clear on what your intention is, right? And then you need to, start to think, well, what are those different levels of engagement? What are those different levels of action, behavior, emotion, access
Hmm.
that we then need to kind of track? And some of those can be diagnostic. There are different ways that you can roll up, those measurements. But once again, it starts with what is your intention?
Okay. We're going to talk about emotions later, because that doesn't make me, as a special forces kid, which is what I call people in the spectrum. As a special forces kid, I don't agree with the concept of emotions, but that's a whole different discussion. But
I think that's a valid discussion because so many are trying to track emotion, and that is a very sticky
yeah,
area,
wicked.
right? And
It's
it's
very sticky wicked. I like that,
yes,
the French, by the
yes,
way.
yes, and
Since you lived in London.
yeah. I do push back on emotions as well because it's very subjective. I don't think that there's, well, I think we have to be careful. And I think that's part of the interrogation. That's part of making sense of all this mess, right? Why do you want to measure emotion? What are you trying to achieve? What is the intention of that engagement? And I think having a better understanding of that intention, once again, will help you with those metrics rather than just kind of taking what you hear other people say. That's kind of, absolute BS in the long run.
Okay, so one small side item, administrative, for those who joined us late, please feel free to drop your questions, comments, or anything you have in the comment section. Whatever channel or network you're using, we'll try to address those. We're halfway through the show, so let's change gears a little bit. I mean, we talk about definitions, we talk about whether it's true, is it is real and stuff, but what can we do? How do you actually, the two parts to this. One is what can we do, and two is how do you make the decision, which is the part that interests me the most, to actually, pardon the pun, engage with engagement. you know, I mean, what can you do about it? Can you do something no matter where you are? Is it for everybody? It's like you work with so many different organizations. Is everybody approaching it the same? Are the differences? Are there like specific things you need to have or understand before you start? Pick any of those. Feel free.
Hmm. I, oftentimes, almost every single almost every single, both from a research perspective as well as from consulting and previous work experience, it's all started with engagement or some type of engagement goal or intention. And I think that before you can jump into engagement, or before you can kind of suss out those levels of engagement, there's definitely an active listening period. It's really getting curious about how people interact, about how they exchange information, how they're building relationships. Are there any relationships to be built? Do people even care about, those types of relationships? Are they looking, I think it's understanding the information ecology and the behavior around the information ecology. And once you have that understanding, then you can start to make the decisions of how you're going to adapt and adopt various types of exercises, various types of experiments. But it has to start with that active listening.
Is this tactical and observational, or digital and analytical? In other words, I mean, do you watch what happens, or do you actually look at the data and,
It has to be both. It has to be both. It's once again depends on intention, right?
Okay.
I don't like to take data at face value, right? Like
Yeah.
data's not neutral. So it's observing behaviors, it's talking and listening with people, it's finding how are we humanizing the data, whether it's good, bad, indifferent, or somewhere, on that spectrum. And I think we've got to get I tend to get really curious about their, organization's digital data collection and use, because I think that can tell a lot about an organization's openness and transparency, and the way that the flow of information, the flow of connection, the flow of community exists both inside their organization and outside of their organization. And so I spend a lot of time kind of really figuring what that looks like, and then developing user stories or use cases that really start to unpack, how do we expand this type of engagement? How do we get more curious about this type of behavior? How do we, bring these different disciplines, these different thoughts, these different projects together and shape a space? Oftentimes, but I see so often that step is skipped or condensed to a point where it's just like, we just want to do that activity, just make it work. We don't care how it works. Just give us that piece of data. You've got this piece of input, and we have a prescribed output, and that's job done. And that's not necessarily how I work.
That doesn't work. I mean, but
it doesn't.
How? I'm sorry, I keep saying how because this is the questions that I have. But replace your favorite word instead of how. You can say can or would you, whatever. But can you bridge the gap between what you're saying and the fact that large organizations are intractable for the most part? I mean, you cannot change a large organization. You cannot change a large organization. It's intractable. No. It's immovable. It's I've been there. Trust me. It's been 3 years. So
oh yeah, same.
Minimal at the best, a tenth of a fucking inch ahead at most. But you can see how much better it could be. But the fact that they're intractable, unmovable, insolvable, right? How do you actually say, okay, you need to change your attitude. You need to change your listening mode. You need to change your understanding. You need to change your processes. You need to. I mean. These are all things that you have to say, and I say them, and you say them, and I know that they don't go too far. But what's the way to for an executive to be faced with this reality, either because they did it before, like you and I, and then say, okay, I'm going to jump back into the fray and do it again, or for somebody who never done it to say, what's in it for me? Oh, fuck it, doesn't matter. I'll do it either way because it has to be done. Can we get to that point? Because if not, then we shut up the show right now and we go home, So.
I'm not going to say no, but
okay,
I
good.
think that
I like the show, so don't say no.
There's considerable amount of work, right? To rethink what we think of and define as an organization, as a business. and our relationships with people. And I think that you're right. I don't think that there's a level of entropy. There's just not a lot of forward momentum in really large organizations. Well, and even small, medium-sized organizations, to be quite frank.
Yeah.
It's a matter of who are the right people. I know it sounds awful to say, but like, who are the right projects? What are the right, combination of people, project ideas that you can show and demonstrate the value of this work? Not, and I use this carefully because I'm not fond of incubation either. Like, I don't think it can be separate. I think that those experiments, those experiences need to be, and this is where I found the most traction with engagement. And people hate it, love or hate it. In that I, work with these different projects, these different teams after that active listening process, but I narrate every step of the work, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It is open and transparent for anybody to see and for everybody to feed in. And that is incredibly uncomfortable because you're seeing the soup, you're seeing the mess. And a lot of people don't like to have that messiness exposed. They like the end result of the messiness, but they don't want to be associated necessarily with that mess. So you've got to reframe it so that it's more of a sense-making process. You've got to create the space for that fear, for that vulnerability, for the creativity to exist. And then you're openly and transparently showcasing what it looks like to those in the organization or to those in the external community who aren't privy to, or like who aren't part of it, but to show them what is possible.
And
And I
why?
think it starts with that.
But
Why?
Why would I do it? Look, I get paid. I got a job. I got a check. I got results, quote unquote results that are similar to last year's plus one or plus two, and it's a great year. I mean, why would I change that? I mean, what is it sounds like a setup question, but it's not. What is happening in the world that is actually forcing me to take that different approach, a different perspective, right? I mean, that I think that the conversations that I had in the last couple of years are very different than the conversations that I had 6, 8, 10 years ago. And the reason for that is because we live in a different world, right? And it's not a political observation. I don't give a shit about politics. It's a reality observation. Generations change, and society changes with it, and workplaces and marketplaces change with them, and it just it's part of the process. So, what would you tell an executive is the number one reason why they need to do this, even though the entire being and the entire decision-making process says don't do it because you're going to put yourself in a compromised situation that it may endanger your career? Is a question. I mean, I don't know. I mean, have you had those conversations? What do you say? Because you have to. I mean, like telling your kids you have to do it because I say so doesn't work, right? So telling an executive you have to do it because you have to. So what is the I mean, go and change the conversation in the last 20 minutes to like, what can we do about it? What's the number one thing, or the first thing that you, like you said, change the mentality, change the outcome, understand the intent, know what you're trying to do, but why do all that? And it's okay if you don't want to say anything, but I have my opinions. They're all wrong. That's why I ask you, because
I love the power of story, right? I mean, you
Oh,
can see from the books here, and you made mention of the fact that I do like a book DNA kind of wrap up of all the
right.
books that I've read. And a lot of it is fiction, and I think we can learn a lot from fiction. And one of the things that I find of great help and use to visualize what the why is after that, that active listening is to shape stories or scenarios that visualize, that narrate what are the possibilities, the good, the bad, and the ugly of what could happen if we do X, Y, Z differently. If we add these various, add these different variables, if we factor in these trends and drivers, how do we divorce people from reality to an extent that they can start to feel more creative and have more agency, more accountability over the decisions that are then made. And so the power of story, I think, is incredibly important in shaping what that why is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how does that land for you?
I totally agree with you. I think that I spend more time working on explaining and embracing and yes, even reading and learning about storytelling in the last 3 years that I did in the first 30 years of my career, right? I mean, and as a point, I mean, when I was a gardener, and yes, I'm gonna brag about it. It's a good flex. When I was a gardener, but when I was a gardener, we had a very set up process for publishing notes, as you can imagine, right? And the notes are pretty, let's say, dry for the most part. I mean, you have, after all, like research data and points that you want to make, and they're very,
Yeah.
generalized. And it fucking sucks to write it. If you think that it sucks to read it, it
Yes.
sucks to write it. You wanna get a voice that is awesome and friendly and embracing, like their blogs, and you end up saying, like, we observe the market goes in a specified direction according to the parameters set up in XYZ.
Yep.
Suck. But you are allowed to do an intro that correlates a story to whatever you're going to present, right? And most analysts did not understand this, and most of the notes said, we set out to find in the market, blah 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 blah, whatever the fuck nobody cares about, right? And then the note goes down from there, and nobody reads it. But there were a few analysts that understood this, and I will mention this. But the nice thing that the editing team did, and yes, we had a huge editing team because every note needs to be exactly the same as the previous one, as far as follow parameters and everything. But the editing team understood this, and every year they give out awards to the most creative intros to the note, right? And yeah, thanks, Brent. I appreciate that note there. I appreciate you saying that. But I've been drinking since we started, dude. I'm halfway there, so don't worry about it.
I can't tell you what's in the mug. It's 8:00 here.
It's water. It's water. It smells so good. but they give awards for the most creative in storytelling and intro, with that calling storytelling, right? And there's this gentleman. I hope that he doesn't care that I mentioned his name, but his name is Whit Andrews, and he's still a gardener. He's probably one of the best analysts I ever met in my life, and I model a lot of my post gardener career around him, and that's two drinks if you're keeping track of gardener. But he's an amazing story writer, and I still remember to this day a note that I read from him where he actually started the note talking about Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants, or whatever the fuck that was, if you remember that historical fact, and how that correlates to something he was talking about search at the time, and how that correlates to the emergence of search. And it was an incredible story that actually enticed you to do something that you normally wouldn't have read and wouldn't have done, right?
Exactly.
And that's a power storytelling. It's not just going to a customer and saying, let me tell you a story about your future success as an executive. It's saying, let me tell you something. I mean, the first show that I did with Alan Bergson, we talk about Girl Revolution, Girl Riot, and yes, I know it was elephants, but I never say anything that I'm not sure of, Brent. but we talk about a riot girl, the Girl Riot, and we ended up in like the impetus of imperfection and things like that. But the impetus of imperfection is the point that I wanted to make. But the story around it and how, Girl Revolution started in Washington near Nirvana at the same time, but it was women instead of men, and how they went a different path, and how they also started the concept of fanzines and everything and all this stuff. That was actually the value to me. That story, that's what actually brought the value more than the actual concept. But by telling this story, people remember the outcome of the story, right?
Exactly.
And that to me is the most important part of storytelling. It's not actually part of telling a story. A story is easy. It has an arc. It can do 2 or 3 arcs. It has an introduction. If you follow the hero's journey, it has a hero faces a problem, solves the problem, wins the exceptional person, because he cannot see girl at the end. It's not more beautiful Princess Vanessa as an exceptional person. So at the end, wins the exceptional person's admiration forever, right? That's a hero journey for the wokeness level. But the story, it's nothing without what you introduce after the story. That's it. That's all I have to say.
I think the story is a brilliant way to get across the why. And sneakily, right? Like it's also communicating legacy, right? Do you want your legacy to be X? Do you want your legacy to be Y? And and even though they might not see the return, they might not be there for that impact for the return. They're setting the stage for that. And there's a part of like the ego that responds to that as well. So it's that's, you know, one hook of using a story. But I find story is the most, and a well-crafted, well-honed, co-developed, understood, you know, intriguing, that it really starts to tease out those elements of curiosity. Those are the best that help illustrate what that why is. And you know, no report, like you said, no report with, you know, your dry kind of details and bullet lists are going to illustrate that why better than a story.
Okay, Brent, that's a clip, by the way. Brent, that's going to be a clip after the show. Just so you know. We have the first TikTok for players, you know. But that's a great statement. I totally agree with you, by the way. That's a great statement. And then, you know, then again, let's go back to the question we're trying to solve. What can an executive do about that? I mean, look, we're all smart people in the room. I mean, we all know that we're trying to accomplish what works best for us and give something back at the same time. You know, and the balance between how much you accomplish for yourself and how much you give back is like, you know, it's on you, right? But what's the, I mean, how? I don't know what the word is. I mean, it's not how, it's not can. It's like, you know, what do we do about it? How do we actually undertake the concept of finding the story that will lead to make the decision on engagement, that will lead to creating a better community internally and external, that will lead to better engagement that is not managed, designed, or manipulated, that will lead to happier people at the end? I mean, I don't know what the intent is, right? But how do we start it? What can you do? What do you do? I mean, pick one. I don't care, anyone. You know.
I think it's
instead of making theoretical. I mean, let's talk about, you know, and I'd be happy to give you. I mean, I know that you do most of the talking, and I hate that part, but I mean, look, I go to people and I say all the time, you need to find a story, right? You need to find a narrative, a story. I mean, Vala Afshar, who works at Salesforce, did a show with the players, you know, with Brent and Paul, where we discuss evangelism, right? And he said one of the things that he's more hyped about is the fact that, you know, the difference between narrative and stories. Stories have an ending, narratives are ongoing, right? That's what he said, and that really stuck with me because it's like such a powerful statement. I mean, if you tell a story, it ends up somewhere. If you tell a narrative, you're part of it, and it's an ongoing statement, right? It keeps evolving, and there's different arcs that create and everything. Yeah. I mean, so when I go to talk to executives about it, when I talk about, like, you know, how do you go to market? What's your message? What's your position? What's your differentiation, right? I mean, practical things that you don't do because you don't care about money, but I do because I'm a greedy asshole. No, but you know, when I go to tell them this, I said, let's find the narrative. Let's find what are the elements that got us here, and how do that shaped us to be who we are, and then how do we take that forward, and then what's the intent or the outcome of that? That's the basis of a narrative, right? So how do you do that? I mean, I you know, you have done many more conversations at executive levels with many more interesting people and organizations that I have. I talk to tech vendors for the most part, you know. I mean, you talk to global, you know, what do you call them, culture organizations, you know, you talk to the US government, you talk to, you know, global, actually more than global, universal corporations, you know. So how do you have these conversations? What do you do? You know,
I mean, from a very tactical standpoint, right? Like I start with, okay, let's to get to that, like, I do talk about the, you know, the importance of narrative. Okay, well, how are we going to get there? What do we need to understand? And so it does have that active listening component, but it's also, like you just said, it's okay, how do we visualize and map? What are those things that have really changed the way our organization functions? What, you know, how our organization, what has been the trajectory of change, the theory of change, the key moments of change? How do we look back to look forward? So really starting to map and visualize what that looks like, and not just the successes, but, you know, the failures, the different moments of impact from internal and external drivers and forces. And then once you're kind of mapping what that looks like, getting really curious, well, why did that change happen? How long did it take for that change to happen? Who is responsible for that change? Did that change have a forward momentum? Did it have, some type of reversal? Are there different trajectories of that change? Then we start to look at, okay, well, what are we thinking of, in the next 0, from now until the next 3 years? What are those different signals of change that we have to be reactive to? Because that's the first place that executives go to. That's the first place that organizations go to. It's the easiest thing for them to, start to think. But then, okay, well, how are you making decisions about what happens after that time frame? How are you not stuck in that strategy, that reactive cycle? How are you? What are you doing to make your decisions? Is it value based? Is it vision based? Is it a combination of the two? What are those signals that you're looking for? What are those different futures? What are those different disciplines that and drivers and forces, trends that are going to impact the way you're doing business, the way that you're communicating, the way that you're fostering or holding that space and community? And then what are those really far out things that maybe are on the periphery that are going to, that may have, some type of impact? And so it's starting to look at what those signals, what those trends, what those drivers look like, and starting to put them into different variables based on that history that you've mapped to create that narrative. Sometimes, I work with organizations to create a custom narrative. Like how are we putting that all together? How are we creating a story around it? Sometimes I take those variables and put them into an already existing, narrative, a story. And I don't use stories that have a crisp, clean ending. I like the short stories. I like to use those stories if I'm using something that's already existing, that have like some really type of, twist or open question, or that, are truly like ongoing. They're not like, it's not a closed thing. Then based upon that, it's figuring out, all right, well, how do we reverse engineer? What do we need to do if we want, to create this type of output or outcome, or we need to be prepared for this type of circumstance? What do we need to do? What do we need to have in place? What is that talent? What are those skills? What are those resources? What are those long-term funding models? Where do we want to start to put in milestones for that short-term, those short-term wins that, start those snackable wins that start to add up? And so it's more of a consistent everyday practice. It's not something that's one and done, but it's something that you are continuously feeding and reevaluating and challenging those variables within that narrative.
Do you have a microphone nearby that you can drop, or have? I have nothing, absolutely zero that I can add to that and say that's a fucking masterclass in 3 minutes on an engagement. Serious, I'm dead serious. I mean, I don't know if we can make a 3-minute clip of that, but that's exactly what I was trying to get out of this. So I'm done. This is the last episode, everybody. Thank you so much. I really have nothing that I can add to that, because that was superb. This is why I think the world of you, and this is why I think you're the smartest people alive. It's like the way you summarize and define what you just said. It's taken me 30 years to get to even understand 1/3 of that. So I'm mesmerized, and I'm and all that stuff.
But I gotta tell you though, it sounds. I get very excited when talking about that process, and that's the work I want to do.
But that's why you're here.
I'm trying to find those organizations, those executives, those cohorts that really want to sink their, teeth into this. This is the fun stuff. This is the stuff that, like, man, this is challenging. This is curious.
Every project that I've done that has even 1/10 of what you just mentioned, it's been fantastic. And I lose myself in it, and the time doesn't matter. yeah, and all that, right? But I don't think you can find somebody who understands everything that is just described. I'm going to be honest. I mean, it's not possible to know all that shit. I don't know how you do, but it's not possible to know all that or understand all that. But break it down. I mean, pick any of those questions that you ask seriously, and that's a starting point, right? I mean,
Yeah,
any of those
definitely.
questions is a starting point. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter your level. Any of those questions is a starting point. You take that, you know, we'll see. Maybe, I don't know, write down the questions and post them somewhere, but it's just I'm absolutely. This is the same approach that I have, but I don't have a brain that is as structured as yours. That's the nicest way to say it, So I'm odd and I'm speechless. We got a couple minutes, so I'm gonna turn this around. Yes, I agree. It's not a good sign. It's a very, very seldom happens if ever sign. But yes, it was really well done. But let me turn this around. Ask me a question while where I recompose and find myself, able to speak again versus babbling like a moron,
Ask you a question?
Yeah, we have 2 minutes. Ask me any question that you want.
Okay, because you and I love to talk about how we're finding inspiration. So
Yeah.
I'm curious for you, and I've asked this of you many times. Like, what are you reading? What are you watching? What are you experiencing that really starts to drive your curiosity? Like it sparks your curiosity.
So I read everything that I can get my hands on, online, offline. I read magazines that people don't even know exist, to dissertations of crap that is hard to even understand what the fuck they're talking about. I read everything because everything has an impact. You never know what's going to get you anything, but I've been saying for the last few months since I started my sabbatical, I spend more time playing poker, right? And people think that it's about doing something, but here's the thing. I have found very few things in life where you get to apply everything that you say, everything that you just said, as you do it in a hand of
So
poker.
true.
When you head on with somebody else, trying to take all their money, they're trying to take all your money. And it's not about the fucking money. I don't care about the money. Seriously, I don't care about the money. Yes, I like to win. I like not to lose like everybody else, but it's not about the money. It's the challenge, the battle of the two intellects going forward, that everybody's telling a story. I tell my story, they tell the story. Who makes the story be more believable? And who has the story that actually aligns with reality better, right? And this is a place that I found to be beyond the money and beyond the fact that stupid people think about gambling, or if anybody else tells me to play the player and not the cards, I will kill them, because that's not what it is. A combination of both. But this is the only place where I found where, truly, honestly, you have to create a narrative and apply the narrative and convince of the narrative and reap the windfalls of the narrative every 35 seconds. Yeah. And if that's not excellent training to be an executive, I don't know what it is. And I think that to me, that's what poker does. It's it brings me my level of intellectual curiosity and ability to actually exercise my brain. It goes into hyperdrive when I play poker, only because every 35 seconds I get the opportunity to be a whole new me, doing a whole new thing, that I haven't done before. And it's just outstanding. But like you, I read everything that I can. I mean, I'm not reading anything, one specific thing. I mean, do I have any? Here, I have a book that I'm reading right now, actually. I have two. There's Hamnet. I don't know if you read it.
Oh, that's a good one. Yes.
Isn't it? It's amazing, right?
Yes, that's really good.
An incredible storytelling. Seriously, incredible storytelling. Mm-hmm. I have this one that Heather gave me. Heather wrote this book. If you don't know Heather, what's her name? Sorry, Heather Whelan's. She does all the drawings. You should do it, because she's the person that Constellation brings to their events, that she draws the chat as it's going along. She draws all the ideas in the chat, and you get these humongous things. We had this, you were a Constellation once. We were in a panel together, I think, and they created one of this. And if I'm mistaken, I apologize, but I think I'm pretty sure you were there. And then you have this visual representation of the 30-minute conversation. Yes. And there's a person who runs that, and she wrote a book called "Draw Your Big Idea." And this book is literally a kid's book, right? I mean, come on, seriously, it's all doodle and drawing and everything.
That's awesome.
But it's amazing the level of smarts that she put into it, and how it structures the way of how you create a narrative and a storyline, and how do you actually take seemingly incongruent ideas to create a narrative. So you should definitely do that. I have a bunch of other books here. I have, the philosophy of Spinoza about deism, and I have what else? I have the Seed of the Soul, the Boys on the Boat. I have this one here that somebody recommended. There's an interesting story. So I'm reading all this shit all the time. So I mean, when you say, what do you read? I don't know. I read everything I can get my hands on. I'm a very curious person, and I read everything until it stops being curious. So
there you go.
Anyways, we're out of time. I cannot thank you enough, because truly, honestly, this was one of the best conversations I ever had in my life about engagement. And I knew that if I push you enough, you would actually come out and like solve the issue for everybody. So thank you. There's nobody else out there that can do consulting on engagement. If they do, they don't do what you said. There's actually liars. So we got the problem solved. But anyways, let me change my mind, friend. So housekeeping. Next week, we're talking with Liz Miller about dichotomies and falsehoods, which is a really good topic. I came up with the title because I like $5 words, and it's going to be interesting. After that, we're going to talk to Alan Bergson about scale and outcomes. Those are the two that are planned. And after that, the floor is wide open. So feel free to suggest topics or anything you want to have discuss. Feel free to suggest people that you want to hear from. I have 3 or 4 guests that I'm working on. It's hard to coordinate times and people with busy schedules, but I would love to have these people talk about things like, data privacy, the aspect, the difference between intent of the law and spirit of the law and things like that. I think they're very, very interesting executive conversations. So as far as you and I, we'll talk again in the very near future, because you are a co-host. You're welcome to come up with your own guest and do your own conversations. I have ideas if you don't. So you can do whatever you want. This is your show as much as it's mine. This is just the introduction to the wonderful, amazing, talented, incredible Dr. Lauren Vargas. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.